They say the world belongs to those who rise before the sun, but there was a time when it belonged to those who knelt before it. Before the first light touched the earth, before any songbird sang, one man was already on his knees, whispering to heaven. While cities still slept, he was awake, wrestling for their souls. Have you ever wondered what happened to the weapon that once set the world on fire? The one that opened prison doors, broke chains, healed the sick, and turned ordinary men into living flames? What if the greatest power God ever gave His people, the power that once brought revival and made nations tremble, is the very power we've stopped using? Everyone today talks about miracles, about methods, about platforms and followers. But only a few still talk about prayer. The truth is, revival was never about crowds or cameras. It was about one heart alone in a quiet room, crying out to God until heaven bent low, and history still remembers one man who didn't just talk about prayer, he lived it until it became his entire life. His name was Edward McKendry Bounds, or simply E.M. Bounds. A quiet pastor from a small town in Tennessee. He didn't have a church with glass walls or thousands of seats. There were no microphones, no famous sermons, no fanfare. Only a small wooden desk, a flickering candle, an open Bible, and 3 sacred hours before dawn. Every morning, while others dreamed, Bounds rose from his bed. There was no alarm clock, no reminder, only hunger, a deep, holy hunger that woke him before the world did. For 40 years, he met God at 4 a.m. And somehow, the world still feels those meetings today. He believed something most people have forgotten, that the world belongs to those who meet God before it wakes. He once wrote, "The men who gain heaven's attention are those who give heaven their time." And for him, that time was before the sunrise, when the air was still and heaven was listening. The floor was cold. The night was silent. The only sound came from a match lighting a candle. He would sit on the same wooden bench, whispering the same names, his flock, his town, his nation. Every name mattered. Every whisper carried weight. He prayed until the room felt alive, until the silence itself seemed to breathe. The candle flickered, casting long shadows across the Bible pages. But the real light was not the flame, it was the fire growing inside him. He understood something many people miss, that true prayer is not emotion, it's consistency. It's showing up even when you don't feel anything. It's the courage to kneel when heaven seems silent. It's faith that refuses to give up. Power, he learned, is not found in moments of excitement or loud declarations. It's forged quietly, in years of persistence. While the world scrolls through screens, chasing connection, he was already connected to heaven, and heaven answered. Not always with miracles, not always with noise, but with nearness. The stillness became his classroom. There, he learned the rhythm of God's heart, the rise and fall of divine breath. Prayer stopped being a duty and became a dwelling. Every dawn became a covenant. He had nothing to prove, only someone to meet. He once said, "To be alone with God in prayer is the highest privilege and the holiest discipline." For Bounds, prayer wasn't something to tick off a list, it was oxygen. He didn't survive without it. When people saw him walking through town later in the morning, they said his face seemed to shine. He spoke softly, but every word carried authority, like a man who had already been in a meeting with God that morning. He never bragged about his prayer life. He didn't need to. The atmosphere around him said everything. Sometimes, he would return to that same wooden bench later in the day. The candle now melted low, the Bible opened to another passage. He would kneel again, whispering, "Lord, do it again, do it in me." It wasn't passion that kept him going. It was discipline. He called discipline the altar on which prayer burns the longest. Because feelings fade, but discipline keeps the fire alive. Imagine it, a single man in a small Tennessee town praying while the rest of the world slept. No cameras, no applause, just quiet faithfulness that would one day shape generation. He didn't pray for fame, he prayed for fire. And he believed that fire could start anywhere, even in an unseen room lit by one candle. To him, prayer was not a ritual. It was a meeting between two worlds. The more he prayed, the more real that other world became. The things of earth grew dim. The voice of heaven grew near. He would sometimes stay there long after sunrise, lost in the presence. The smell of burning wax filled the room, and the light of dawn touched the walls. Outside, people began their day. Inside, heaven was still touching earth. He once wrote in his notes, "God does not measure prayer by volume, but by devotion. The quietest voice may shake eternity, if spoken from a surrendered heart." And that was exactly what he lived. He prayed until prayer became his nature. Until he didn't have to think about praying, he simply breathed it. Neighbors said they often saw him walking at sunrise, lips moving, eyes lifted. He prayed in his steps, in his pauses, in his silence. Every action became intercession. For him, prayer wasn't the work before the work. It was the work. When people later asked how revival begins, Bounds didn't give long strategies or formulas. He simply said, "Revival begins when one man takes prayer seriously." He believed that revival was never born on stages, but on floors soaked with tears. Before we speak of fire that spreads, we must first visit the hidden flame that starts it, the secret place, the unseen altar. The moments when no one is watching but heaven is paying attention. That's where God forges his weapons. And Bounds was one of them. In his small study, that candle became more than light. It became a symbol of a world that prayer could still reach. He prayed for people he had never met. He prayed for nations he had never visited. He prayed for pastors who hadn't been born yet. Every whisper seemed to echo into eternity. He believed that the prayers we pray in secret travel farther than we think. That somewhere, years later, someone's miracle might still be burning from the match you struck today. So he prayed, and prayed again, and kept praying. When nothing changed, he still prayed. When everything changed, he prayed even more. He used to say, "The man who stops praying because nothing happens is like a farmer who stops planting because one seed didn't grow." He refused to stop planting. By the time most people woke up and stretched their arms to face the day, he had already touched heaven, and heaven had touched him. He didn't ask for ease. He asked for endurance. He didn't ask for wealth. He asked for wisdom. He didn't ask for fame. He asked for fire, and God gave it. Not as a flash of glory, but as a lifelong flame. He learned that prayer doesn't always change things instantly. It changes you until you can change things. That was his rhythm. Rise, kneel, whisper, wait, again and again, until the rhythm of heaven became his heartbeat. When people saw him later in life, frail and thin, they didn't see weakness. They saw a man whose body was tired, but whose spirit was blazing. Because while others chased influence, he chased intimacy. That's the secret that made him dangerous to darkness. The devil fears many things, preachers, singers, planners, but he fears one thing most: a praying man who refuses to stop. And that was E.M. Bounds, the quiet pastor whose name the world almost forgot, but whose prayers heaven never did. That morning discipline, the first fire, was where it all began. A man, a candle, a Bible, a bench, and a God who still answers when his people call. That was his beginning. But as every fire burns, it must be tested. The same knees that touched heaven would soon kneel in the ashes of war, because no flame burns bright without facing the wind. Every fire that burns for God must be tested. Every soul that glows with light must first pass through darkness. The same knees that once touched heaven would soon kneel among ashes. For E.M. Bounds, the test came wrapped in war. When the Civil War tore through America, he did not hide behind safety. He went to the front lines, not with a gun, but with a Bible. He served as a chaplain, carrying prayer into places where hope was dying. The world around him became a battlefield of blood and dust. He walked through fields littered with torn flags and broken dreams. Everywhere he looked, death had left its signature. The cries of young soldiers echoed through the smoke boys who would never return home. He prayed over bodies, preached over graves, and watched men breathe their last. He learned quickly that faith must stand when hope has fallen. Twice he was captured, twice imprisoned. And in those cold, silent cells, he discovered something deeper than freedom, that suffering does not silence a calling, it sanctifies it. He later wrote, "Prayer is born of need." It is the language of the helpless. And in those moments, he was helpless indeed, but that helplessness became holy. Because when everything is stripped away, your plans, your comforts, your control, what remains is the truth of your heart before God. Pain has a strange way of burning off pride. And as pain stripped him bare, only hunger for God remained. When he finally returned to Franklin, Tennessee, the war had ended, but the destruction hadn't. Homes were burned to ashes. Churches stood empty. Families were divided. The streets carried ghosts of laughter that no longer lived there. Most people saw ruin, but Bounds saw altars waiting for fire. He didn't rush to preach sermons. He didn't try to rebuild his reputation. He went back to what he knew: prayer. Before rebuilding walls, he rebuilt fellowship with heaven. Once again, 4 a.m. found him on his knees. He prayed for a people who had forgotten how to hope. The town was silent, but slowly, something began to stir. Ashes started to breathe again. Enemies began to forgive. A widow sang for the first time in years. Bars emptied. Altars filled. No newspaper covered it. No choir performed it. But heaven noticed. He had learned a truth that would shape the rest of his life. That pain can purify a man until his very breath becomes intercession. When God breaks you, He's not punishing you, He's preparing you. He's molding your heart to carry the weight of someone else's burden. Every tear you cry in secret becomes a seed of revival. And yet, even as revival touched Franklin, Bounds refused applause. He didn't stand on platforms or take credit. He knew something that many forget. Every flame fades if discipline ends. So, he kept his schedule. Every dawn, every whisper, every prayer. Years passed. The crowds left. The noise faded. But he stayed. He once said, "The praying man is not the one who talks most about prayer, but the one whose heart never stops talking to God." That was the rhythm of his life. The revival had quieted, but something deeper remained. Pain had done its work. It had carved endurance into his soul. He had seen God move in tragedy, and now he would learn to meet Him in silence. Not every revival begins with noise. Some begin in quiet rooms where no one hears you but God. After Franklin's awakening, E.M. Bounds slipped into obscurity. No newspaper headlines, no applause, just mornings and prayer. But he kept the rhythm. 4 a.m. still found him waiting. The same wooden bench, the same candlelight, the same whisper, "Lord, I'm here." He called silence, the holy stillness that prepares a man for God's voice. There were mornings when heaven seemed closed, when his prayers echoed back unanswered, when the silence itself felt heavy, like a door that wouldn't open. But he discovered something precious. That silence speaks louder than applause. That stillness is not God's absence, it's His invitation. When nothing happened, he stayed. When no miracle came, he still prayed. When no voice answered, he kept listening. And that's how silence speaks. It turns faith into fire. Our generation runs from that kind of quiet. We fill every pause with noise, every minute with motion. We scroll, we post, we plan. But fire needs oxygen, and oxygen is found in stillness. He waited, and the waiting became worship. Those who met him said that he carried the presence of God like a fragrance. He had spent so much time in silence that heaven clung to him. He didn't need to speak to make people feel God. His presence said enough. He didn't know it yet, but those unseen years were shaping something eternal. Every uncelebrated morning, every unseen tear was laying the foundation for books that would outlive him. He had no idea that his quiet devotion was preparing a legacy that would one day ignite nations. If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever prayed and heard nothing, remember this: silence is not rejection, it's refinement. God speaks most clearly in stillness. He was teaching Bounds that the voice of heaven is often a whisper, and you can't hear a whisper if you never stop talking. In that silence, something new was being born. A burden, not a weight that crushed him, but one that called him deeper. The fourth fire was about to begin, but before we step into it, pause here for a moment. Because silence is not wasted time, it's sacred time. It's the space where God rebuilds what life has broken. E.M. Bounds' life teaches us that the measure of a man is not how loudly he shouts for God, but how quietly he listens for him. When you learn to wait, you become dangerous. Because the world no longer controls your pace, heaven does. And when heaven leads, revival always follows. In the silence, a new fire began to stir within him. It wasn't loud, it didn't roar. It whispered, but that whisper carried weight, the weight of souls. E.M. Bounds began to feel the heartbeat of entire cities pressing against his chest. It was as if heaven had placed the pain of the world in his heart. He could no longer pray small prayers. Peace wasn't enough anymore. He began to wrestle for souls. Prayer became warfare. He stood between heaven and earth, refusing to move until something shifted. Those who prayed beside him in the early mornings said it sometimes felt like thunder rolled through the room, even when he only whispered. He once wrote, "God shapes the world by prayer." The more prayer there is, the more power there will be. To him, prayer wasn't preparation for battle. It was the battle itself. When he prayed, time disappeared. He would rise hours later, drenched in sweat, his face glowing with quiet intensity. He didn't fight with weapons, he fought with words that pierced the unseen. When he walked through town afterward, people could sense something different. Even those who didn't believe felt peace when he passed. That's what happens when someone comes from God's war room. They carry the fragrance of heaven's victory. But this fire, this holy wrestling, was not meant to remain his alone. The same hands that fought in prayer would soon hold a pen that burned like a sword. The whispers of his prayer room would soon roar across generations through his writing, and the world would never pray the same way again. Before we move forward, think of this. There are two kinds of prayer: the kind that ends when you say Amen, and the kind that begins when you can't stop. Bounds lived the second kind. He would often cry, "Lord, if I can't carry the whole world, let me at least carry a part of it." His prayers were not safe or shallow, they were dangerous. They demanded something. They called heaven to intervene. He prayed until the impossible began to look small. And he wanted others to know this kind of fire too. That's why, when he picked up his pen, the fifth fire began. The fire of words that still burn today. When prayer becomes your life, your words start to burn. You can't hide it. You can't contain it. E.M. Bounds never set out to be an author. He wanted only to pray. But the same spirit that drove him to his knees began to push thoughts into his mind, truths too heavy to keep silent. He started to write between his prayer hours, simple sentences soaked in devotion, paragraphs born in agony. Every line felt like a spark from the altar of his secret place. He said, "Books are sermons that continue preaching when the voice is still." So he wrote, by candlelight, in worn notebooks, with trembling hands and tired eyes, but a fire that refused to die. His writings circled around one message: prayer is the strongest force on earth because it connects weak people to an almighty God. He finished one manuscript after another, carefully placing them in boxes under his desk. No publisher came calling, no offers, no fame, only rejection letters and silence. But he didn't stop. He told a friend, "If men will not read them now, heaven will release them later." He believed that prayer itself would carry his words where his name could not go. He wrote titles like Power Through Prayer, The Weapon of Prayer, The Necessity of Prayer, and Purpose in Prayer. Every sentence was a match, every chapter a flame. He wasn't just teaching prayer, he was releasing it. He wrote like a man who had seen God, not studied him. As his body weakened, he turned his bed into an altar and his pen into a sword. He whispered as he wrote, "If I cannot speak, I will still fight through words." He didn't know it then, but each page was preparing an army he would never meet. An army of intercessors who would rise long after he was gone. The world might have forgotten his name, but heaven was keeping his manuscripts safe, stored like arrows, waiting for their appointed time. E.M. Bounds passed from this world on August 24th, 1913. There was no grand funeral. No crowd, no public honor, only a few friends and a simple headstone. He died with a trunk full of unpublished manuscripts. No one knew what those pages contained, but prayer doesn't die with the one who prayed it. It lives on, moving quietly through time, waiting to be answered. Years later, a man named Homer W. Hodge discovered those dusty boxes. He opened the yellowed pages and realized he was holding treasure. He began to read and he wept. Every sentence felt alive. Every paragraph burned with power. Hodge edited, published, and released them to the world. And suddenly, the world caught fire. Power through prayer spread through seminaries. The weapon of prayer landed in the hands of preachers and revivalists. Missionaries carried his books into jungles, deserts, and faraway lands. Whole movements were born from his words. Leonard Ravenhill quoted him often. Rhys Howells studied him in the Bible College of Wales. Billy Graham said, E.M. Bounds' writings ought to be read by every preacher who would preach with power. From Korea's dawn prayer mountains to America's early morning watch groups, the fingerprints of Bounds remain. A century later, believers still rise at 4 a.m., whispering the same words he once did. He died unknown, but now his fire burns on every continent. God proved something through his story. When a man hides in prayer, heaven makes sure his influence can't be buried. The enemy buried his body, but not his flame. Even in death, Bounds preaches louder than many living voices. He left no cathedral, no ministry empire, no inheritance of gold. Only a heritage of prayer that outlives fame. He once said, "The church is looking for better methods. God is looking for better men." That single sentence continues to shape preachers, intercessors, and dreamers across the world. His legacy is not a monument of stone, it's a movement of hearts. And that legacy holds up a mirror to our generation, asking one burning question: what will remain when our lights go out? More than 100 years have passed. The world has changed beyond recognition. Yet, the same hunger remains. We post more than we pray. We plan more than we wait. We chase strategy more than surrender. But the secret that shook heaven still waits for anyone who will kneel long enough to rediscover it. E.M. Bounds proved that one life set on fire can light up a century of darkness. His secret wasn't talent. It wasn't intellect. It was surrender. He met God before dawn until one day, the dawn began to meet God through him. If the church today feels powerless, it's because the altars are empty. We build programs when God is calling us to build prayer rooms. We chase platforms when heaven is looking for kneeling hearts. The story of E.M. Bounds is not nostalgia, it's a summons. The same fire that burned in Franklin, Tennessee, is still searching for hearts to ignite. He once wrote, "Prayer succeeds when all else fails, because God never fails." That truth hasn't changed. If you feel your fire fading, this is your moment to rebuild the altar. It doesn't start with eloquence. It starts with returning. Go back to your secret place. Wake before the world does. Whisper until heaven leans down again. The revival we long for won't come through noise. It will come through kneeling. The next great awakening will not be televised. It will begin in someone's small room at 4 in the morning, maybe yours, because the fire that burned in E.M. Bounds was never meant to die. It was meant to multiply. And if you're listening now, you are proof that it still burns. So pause for a moment. Write it down in your heart. Lord, Teach me how to pray. Then act on it. Choose your hour. Guard it fiercely. Meet God there. Let it be said of you, as it was said of him, he touched heaven every morning, and heaven touched earth through him. When the final book is read, when the last sermon ends, God will not ask how many followers you gained or how many views you had. He will ask one question. Did you walk with me before the dawn? The hidden fires of E.M. Bounds still call to a prayerless generation. Wake up, light the candle, open the Bible, kneel again. Because prayer is not the work before the work, it is the work, and the weapon that still burns is waiting in your hands. If this story has stirred something in you, don't just scroll away. Join the movement that keeps the flames of revival alive. Walk with us through the forgotten lives of those who carried God's fire. Every week, we uncover the hidden paths of prayer, holiness, and power stories the world ignores, but heaven remembers. If your heart longs for that kind of faith, this message is for you. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and let's keep the flame burning together, because revival doesn't end with a story, it begins with you.